Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT governance webinar on the new cyber incident reporting obligations that you need to be aware of in the European Union and in the United States. IT governance, as you probably already know, has been in the business of cybersecurity, information security, governance, risk management, and compliance for some 20 years. We're now about 200 people across the UK, the EU, and the US, with some 12,000 clients and an awful lot of experience delivering a wide range of solutions to our clients. I'm Alan Calder. I'm your host for today. I set the business up some 20 odd years ago, writing a book on IT governance, which was really about cybersecurity and what's now ISO 27001, written a number of other books around cybersecurity and compliance, and been involved in a number of aspects of how the industry has developed. Today's webinar is about a 45 minutes in total. So we're going to talk about the key cybersecurity challenges as a result of the rapid escalation in cyber warfare. We're going to look at the US cyber incident reporting requirements, the EU corporate accountability rules and how those are changing, the EU-US agreement on data transfer mechanisms and what's emerging around that, and some practical steps to avoid non-compliance implementing a cyber defense in-depth strategy. So about 45 minutes of me talking through those topics. You will have noticed that you're all on mute as you join the webinar. You can at any time ask a question through the Q&A functionality, which with a bit of luck is showing on the top right-hand side of your screen. Please do, if you have a question, type it into that. We'll pick those questions up. We've got 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to deal with Q&A. And I'll pick up any questions that you've posed for me. I'll share them with the audience, and then assuming that it's within my skill set, I will answer it for you. So that's how to make sure that we hear you. The slides and the recording will be made available to everybody overnight. So that tends to be the first question people ask. Yes, you can get a recording. You can follow through it at your own time of today's briefing. So, key legal changes as a result of cyber warfare. And it's kind of interesting because for a long time, what you got where cyber security was concerned and the law was mostly laws telling you what you couldn't do. Things like the Computer Misuse Act, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, all of that was about curbing legally what people might do on or through computers. A lot has changed, particularly over the last 5 years, and we've seen a number of countries incorporate cyber warfare into their military doctrine. So you hear increasingly countries, nation states talking about waging war in 5 domains. That's the traditional air, land, and sea of the kind of traditional kinetic warfare, plus, of course, space, and more recently, cyberspace. Space is the place in which there are multiple satellites. The ICBMs touch on or can touch on the edge of space. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on around the edge of our atmosphere. And in terms of the internet, the space much closer to home. There's an awful lot of crime going on there, but an awful lot of cyber warfare as well. And that's not surprising given the extent to which governments and militaries rely on communications and the data which is made available through the internet. So just to take half a dozen examples, the US has a unified cyber command. The UK has the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is sat right next to GCHQ in Cheltenham. Russia has the Federal Security Services Centre for Information Security. Here in the West, we think of Russia and Iran as the bad guys. They no doubt sit there and think of us as the bad guys. So all we've got to do right now is accept the reality that all countries. China has the Cyberspace Administration of China. Japan has a National Center for Incident Readiness. North Korea has a cybersecurity or cyber offensive criminal team who keep the economy afloat. Israel has a very significant cyber capability. So in each of these major nation states, you get centers set up, fully staffed, big government budgets, whose job is to defend the country's network from attack and to consider launching counterattacks against enemies. And counterattacks are not that straightforward. Hacking back is more complex in cyberspace than one would like to think it is. But the starting point is, of course, how do you protect your networks and your data from attack by whoever you are either at real war with or involved in some kind of proxy war. In terms of impact, of course, when as with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is an awful lot of cyber attacks focused on Ukrainian infrastructure. When Finland and Sweden started talking about joining NATO, there was an increase in cyber attacks on those countries. And the reality is that cyber warfare is a relatively low-cost way of wreaking fairly major impacts onto countries that you think of as being enemies. Not directly lethal. The lethal impacts come as a result of ways in which cyber infrastructure is disrupted and what that can do to people. But cyber warfare is not as directly lethal as, for instance, a cruise missile. So the kind of actions which nation states take, America is a very good example of a country which has been moving at pace to improve its cybersecurity defensive capability. In the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, has proposed and is consulting on a very robust cyber incident reporting procedure for listed companies. That's companies listed on all US stock exchanges, which would require them to report cyber incidents, report paying ransoms, but more importantly, would place on organizations an obligation to have at board level a thorough understanding of cyber risk and to be able to demonstrate that the board has taken appropriate steps to protect itself from cyber risk. In March, US Congress passed what is neatly called the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. That requires critical infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, and critical national infrastructure is hospitals, logistics, government, of course, manufacturing companies, all that infrastructure on which the survival of an economy fundamentally depends, to report significant cyber incidents and ransomware payments within a very short space of time. In May, the government announced the creation of a new US task force to help streamline federal efforts on combating ransomware attacks. Ransomware, in case you're not aware of it, has become the most prolific form of attack, delivered primarily through phishing emails. And President Biden signed into law what's now called the Better Cybercrime Metrics Act and the National Cybersecurity Preparedness Act in May. That brings with it specific requirements around reporting and gathering information about cybercrime to enable better preparation of nation state or American defenses against cyber attacks. The UK government has confirmed that it's bringing forward a data reform bill to reform data protection law in the UK. We're not at this point clear about which elements of the government's consultation on the future of UK GDPR will appear in the bill, but nevertheless, there will be a set of legal requirements in there around, or changing legal requirements around how UK organizations have to act to protect personal data. Already sat inside UK GDPR are the requirements that organizations apply appropriate technical and organizational controls, technical and organizational measures to protect personal data. The requirement is to apply measures that reflect the state of the art and which are proportionate to the value of the personal data being protected. and in an environment where the technical capability of attackers is continuing to improve all of the time, it means that the technical capability of defenders has to keep on improving as well. Otherwise, you're struggling to demonstrate that you're deploying defenses which reflect the state of the art. In the UK, the Attorney General has said that cyberspace is not a lawless grey zone. International law governs and plays a fundamental role in regulating cyberspace. Yes, that's true. It's kind of not as easy for cyber cops to deal with cybercrime as it is for analog cops to deal with crime in the real world. But nevertheless, law is increasingly being put in place to provide a basis on which cybercrime and nation-state cyber warfare can be dealt with legally. The CEO of Building Cybersecurity said Russia has got some of the best engineers in the world working on the perfect attack that can cloak itself, make it look like something else, and move laterally inside the network once it's in there, delete assets, delete network capability. And it's that kind of capability that one has to be particularly aware of, attacks which move inside networks without you being aware of them. The US Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, CISA, has urged critical national infrastructure organizations to prepare for potential Russian cyber attacks. If working with Ukrainian organizations, take extra care to monitor, inspect, and isolate traffic from those organizations, closely reviewing access controls for that traffic. Similarly, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre updated its guidance saying that UK organizations should bolster their cybersecurity resilience in response to malicious cyber incidents in and around Ukraine. In other words, given the extent to which Russia has invaded Ukrainian land space, has taken over a number of government offices in the south and east of Ukraine, it's not necessarily very easy to tell which attacks coming out of Ukraine or which activity coming out of Ukraine is genuinely one of your providers, as distinct from one which has been taken over or infiltrated or successfully attacked by Russian nation-state attackers. So very clear message that in this environment, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, organizations need to be paying particular attention to risks that are associated with the war in Ukraine. In the UK, the Defence Secretary has put another £22 million worth of funding into an Army Cyber Operations Centre, recognising that it's increasingly important for the Army itself to know how to deal with cyber attacks, saying that we know all about the dangers, whether the attacks come from Russia, China or North Korea, activists, criminals or extremists, whether it's malware or fake news. Cyber attacks can bring down the national infrastructure. Cyber enemies think they can act with impunity. We must show them, she said, that they can't, that we're ready to respond at a time and place of our choosing in any one of the domains, not just the virtual world. We need coherent cyber offense as well as defense. So the £22 million worth of investment is to create operational centers which can be part of cyber offense. So we see clearly a rapid move, not just to banning things, but to applying law in cyberspace, to requiring organizations to report cyber incidents, report ransomware payments, and now increasingly investment in the development of offensive capability in cyberspace. So let's look in a bit more detail at what's happening inside the US. Quite often what happens in the US is a precursor to what we see happen in the UK and elsewhere. And there is certainly an echo of what's happening in the US taking place in the EU and the national infrastructure, the Network and Information Security Directive. So the US Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022 signed into law in March. It's a federal law aimed at improving the ability of national infrastructure to prevent and respond to cyber attacks. It requires operators of critical infrastructure and all federal agencies to report cyber attacks to CISA within 72 hours and ransomware payments within 24 hours. So you can imagine therefore, that organizations that might before March have tried to sweep these things under the carpet now know that within 72 hours of identifying that they've been attacked, they need to be dealing with the attack and reporting it, and they need to report within 24 hours. So that has to mean an increase in investment by national infrastructure organizations into their processes and infrastructure to enable them to do that kind of stuff, just so they can comply with the law. It applies to covered cyber incidents. That doesn't mean minor ones, it means major incidents, and to all ransomware payments. There will come a time when paying ransoms because of ransomware will become illegal, but in a number of countries it's still a legal thing to do, and for insurers it's the fastest way to get organizations back up and running, assuming that the ransomware attacker is one that will give you the keys after an attack, and that's not always going to be the case. The notification requirements are broadly in line with what the EU and UK General Data Protection regulations require. They require the reporting of cybersecurity incidents to the National Security Agency within 72 hours of the incident being identified. There is no requirement to report ransomware payments in the EU or the UK yet, but certainly it's in the US a very clear demonstration of the understanding that there needs to be better policy in plan to prevent attacks on critical infrastructure. You can't prevent attacks unless you know they're happening. You can't prevent attacks unless you know how successfully ransomware is being dealt with. If you gather the information together, you've got the chance of crafting a response capability which can better defend critical infrastructure. So in the US, there are now a number of sector-specific agencies which deal with critical infrastructure. For those of you in the US looking at how you comply, these are the agencies which deal with the sector specifically. So DHS and through DHS CIRCIA deals with the chemical sector, commercial facilities, comms, critical manufacturing, dams, emergency services, information technology, nuclear reactors, and you can see how that's dealt with. So that kind of gives you a sense both of what the critical sectors are in each of in the United States, and which agency exists to deal with those in terms of responding to cyber attacks. So what do those look like? Colonial Pipeline, May 21. It operates the largest oil pipeline in the US, was hit by a ransomware attack, which caused a major disruption to services. The Colonial Pipeline is on the East Coast, but bringing oil from elsewhere in the US. Disrupted services for a considerable period of time, big surge in petrol prices, approximately $4 million the Colonial Pipeline had to pay in Bitcoin to get the ransom, to pay the ransom and to get the decryption keys back from the attackers. And remember, not all attackers will A, give you the decryption keys, or B, not also have stolen the data, which they will then ask you to give them a similar sum in order not to release your data onto the internet. In May, in the EU, Ireland's health service was crippled by a ransomware attack, which ran for a number of weeks. It forced the health service to shut down all operations, and that was the Conti ransomware gang, who in the last week or so have been fingered as bringing a major ransomware attack against the Costa Rican government. And that kind of gives you a sense of the extent to which cyber warfare is not just waged by nation state on nation state. It can be waged by a criminal, serious organized crime gang, often operating within the protection or allowed to operate by a nation state, might attack another nation state. Anonymous has set itself out to tackle Russian cyber gangs. So you see people setting themselves up as good guys and bad guys on both sides of the current war taking place in Ukraine. But all of that has damaging impacts on critical national infrastructure, on hospitals. There was a death in Germany as a result of somebody unable to have an operation a year or so ago, ransomware attack on a hospital. And as I said, while the number of lethal attacks are low, that's really just a matter of time. In September 2021, the DarkSide ransomware gang took out the online networks of an agricultural cooperative in Iowa. They locked the cooperative's data, sensitive information and systems, and in return for a $5.9 million ransom, they said they would provide the decryption key. The cooperative decided that its best option was take its systems offline while it tried to deal with the issue. And that, of course, had an impact on hundreds of farmers around the Midwest in terms of them being able to deal with just making their farms operate, shifting produce and so on. In January last year, a criminal hacker attempted to poison a water treatment plant in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that was identified because an operator logged on to their device and saw the cursor moving around apparently under its own steam. The hacker had managed to get into the company's TeamViewer platform and was hard at work deleting programs that treated and cleaned water at the plant. The incident was discovered. The poisoning was possible for it to be reversed. But, you know, if that had managed to go ahead, if it hadn't been discovered, there would have been potentially major impact across the whole Bay Area. So kind of a flavor of why organizations need to be taking steps to protect themselves from cyber attack in today's environment. So how do you report a cyber incident? And it's worth talking about it from a CIA perspective in the US, because it's a legal set of requirements. It applies in the US. It's likely, therefore, to be a logical way of dealing with stuff. And the starting point is what has happened. So the first thing is to describe the cyber incident, what has been taken down, and then, and this might take time to do, to identify which vulnerabilities were exploited, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the attackers use to exploit vulnerabilities. And typically, dealing with an incident like this takes a considerable period of time because an organization has to, first of all, contain the incident, has to protect its systems from proliferation, has to get on top of operations, work out how to restore operations, but you need to go through the rest of the process. What vulnerabilities were exploited? That helps us identify who the malicious actor was. Was it a nation state? Was it a ransomware gang? That can help understand what the best response is. If it's a ransomware operator, then one can focus on how genuine they are as a ransomware operator. Is this somebody who is known to deliver the decryption keys in turn for payments for ransom? Is there a possibility of negotiating the price? How do we deal with that? If it's not, what are our other options? All of that you can't really work out until you've got thorough information about what happened. You need to know what vulnerabilities were exploited, because that tells you what else could go wrong. If we shut down our systems while we deal with the attacker, have we protected ourselves, or are there other areas in which those same vulnerabilities exist? Has the malware uploaded into our backups? You need to understand the full structure of the incident before you can genuinely deal with it. And the CIA reporting requirements reflect those needs. So in the EU, what is happening? What do they mean for directors and senior managers? Well, not surprisingly, again, driven by the proliferation of cyber attacks, the extent to which ransomware and phishing attacks have become so widespread, and of course the attacks on governments and critical national infrastructure as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, as a result of what's happening in the Baltics and Nordics. EU countries and lawmakers have agreed that cybersecurity rules need to be made tougher. At the end of 2020, the Network and Information Security Directive, which originally came out at much the same time as the EU GDPR back in 2018. Proposals were made to the European Commission to strengthen it. It's been working its way through the European systems since then. The first directive was originally established in 2016, as I said, came into force in 2018. But what NIS2 does is expand the scope of the Network Information Security Regulations. It requires all organizations, in any case, to assess cybersecurity risk, to notify local supervisory authorities, and take appropriate technical and organizational measures to prevent risks. And those technical and organizational measures include cybersecurity measures, governance frameworks, business continuity frameworks, cyber incident reporting frameworks. All of those are expected to be part of how the organization goes about dealing with cyber security. In the EU and in the UK, because NIS1 became part of the UK's legal infrastructure on the completion of Brexit. In both cases, the fine for non-compliance can be up to 2% of global turnover. In the EU, so NIS is being revised across the EU. It's expected the revision will go into force probably end of June this year. There'll be an 18-month compliance window. It will apply to medium-sized organizations as well as to large organizations, but it is a directive, so it's likely to have different implementation requirements in all 27 member states of the EU. And at the moment, it does not appear that the UK is planning to revise its version of NIS. It is interesting to note, though, that in the UK, the Department for Work and Pensions, for instance, is requiring organizations that are frontline contractors and increasingly second and third line contractors, not only to have Cyber Essentials Plus and ISO 27001 certifications, but also to take on and do a SOC 2 annual audit. And it makes sense to prepare for a SOC 2 audit at the same time as you're doing ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials, because that means you can build a single integrated cybersecurity management system. But it's worthwhile seeing the new EU rules on corporate accountability applying very broadly across a much wider swathe of critical national infrastructure, have in them the requirement that incidents are reported, and that reflects what's already in EU GDPR, that data protection incidents have to be reported to the supervisor within 72 hours. The Internal Market Commissioner said cyber threats have become bolder and more complex. It was imperative to adapt the security framework to the new realities to make sure citizens and infrastructures are protected. Cooperation and rapid information sharing are of paramount importance, and with the agreement of NIS2, we modernize our rules in the EU to secure more critical services for society and economy. And it's that one of the capabilities that NIS2 puts in place, which is better sharing of cybersecurity information that helps organizations across the European Union better act together to protect one another against the whole of the EU. So the objective of NIS2 is to strengthen cyber resilience. And we'll hear more and more about cyber resilience, the idea that organizations should not just be able to defend themselves against cyber attacks, but should recognize that cyber attacks will penetrate one or more layers of your defense mechanisms. And therefore you need the resilience that enables you to soak up, so to speak, the punches and still recover and still keep going. So cyber resilience will become a key aspect in sectors like healthcare, medical devices, energy grids, the very broad digital services market, waste management, product manufacturing, finance, banking, public administration, logistics, and so on. Top management is accountable under NIS2 for non-compliance with the cybersecurity obligations, and there is increasing requirements to protect supply chains and supplier relationships and to make sure that those are appropriately secured as well. So security of supply chains, security and supplier relationships becomes a key implementation element of NIS2 compliance. So you can see how what DWP in the UK is doing, pushing SOC 2 down through its tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. NIS2 is doing in the EU, pushing cybersecurity accountability down from major corporations through their supply chains, trying to build a more secure, wider infrastructure across the European Union and effectively internationally, because supply chains are global, not just EU-based. So one of the other parallel strands going on from a legal perspective is the transfer of data between the European Union and the United States. You'll all be aware that effectively at the moment it's illegal for an EU data controller to transfer data to the United States. By illegal, I simply mean that it's legal as long as you can prove that the data cannot be accessed by an American legal entity who has access to NSA rights to collect personal data or access personal data. And that's very difficult to do. So the Privacy Shield was declared invalid as a result of what's called the Schrems II action. Max Schrems, who runs the None of Your Business, NOIB, not-for-profit organization, and the European Commission and the US Federal Trade Commission have been negotiating a new transatlantic data privacy framework. They reckon they've arrived at a solution. We don't yet know the detail of it. The objective is to make it easy for data flows between the EU and the US to take place. But the reality is that unless it's really watertight, you can rely on Schrems and NOIB bringing another action against it. So there's likely to be a period of 2 or 3 years during which the framework is in place, and while a court action works its way through the EU CJ. But who knows, they might come up with something which is watertight. But nevertheless, it creates another legal challenge around data protection. How, if you are making sure you're dealing with personal data as well as all the rest of your data, and you're dealing with data flows between the EU and the US, do you ensure that if the transatlantic data privacy framework comes into force, you're going to be able to protect data both legally and in fact during the period that it's in force, so that you are in a position where if there is a successful challenge, you don't have to scramble to rebuild defenses that you might have put in place now. But certainly the global data flows look as though they will continue to be a complex area to deal with. So the steps that it looks as though you're going to go through as part of the data privacy framework will be conducting a gap analysis against the new framework, the requirements that you need to have in place, create or update your inventories of data, reassess the security and privacy practices that you have and which your American data processors or joint controllers might have, review contracts with suppliers and third parties, identify and create new processes and policies for international data transfers, and evaluate your existing processes against those policies and processes to make sure that they're working where appropriate, which is, as in all cases, adopt the new EU general standard contractual clauses for data transfers. That's a sensible thing to do, even if you're going to rely on the new transatlantic data privacy framework, because it kind of gives you long-term protection. But it becomes a more structured process that you need to go through to demonstrate compliance with the emerging framework. It's not yet available, but it's going to be a key part of the landscape. And mapping data, where does the data flow? Identifying where you collect it from, who has access to it, which countries it goes to, who can see it, what it's used for. All of those become more and more important elements of future-proofing your data protection framework, your cybersecurity framework. It's quite clear that increasingly data supervisory authorities around the EU are fining organizations because they've failed to ensure that only an appropriate elements of data is made available to a partner, that it's only made available for the requisite amount of time. So data flow mapping becomes a really fundamental part of effective data compliance in the emerging environment. So detailed gap analysis, make sure that all of your data flows both inside the UK, the EU, are compliant. Make sure that if you are likely to have to comply with either the existing incident reporting requirements in the EU, in the UK, or in the US, or what the SEC looks as though it's going to be putting in place, you can kind of assume that what it's consulting on is probably going to come down as a set of standard requirements. You need to know what data you have. You need to know when you're looking at what attack has taken place. You need to be able to go, well, if they've got into that particular asset, then they've been able to access that data. If they've been able to access that data, they've been able to see the following elements. So mapping data, being really, really clear about the data inventory, where you're holding data, is a critical component of putting yourself in a position where you can genuinely respond to a cyber attack in a way that enables you to deal with it effectively. You can't be sure that your data flows comply with the current state of law, both in terms of international transfers, if you don't know where they are, and you need to go into some detail. For instance, you might have a website which processes data, and you say to yourself, my website's hosted in the UK, so all of the personal data processed on it is the UK. That's fine. But if you are using an email client on the website, perhaps to handle fulfillment, and that email client is not yours, but is provided by an organization, let us say in the US, you will be processing personal data in the US, and without appropriate measures in place, you could find that you are in breach of UK GDPR or EU GDPR, as the case may be. So you really do need to be clear about what applications are processing what data and where. You can't protect data unless you know where it is and how to protect it. And the wrong time to be trying to work out what's happened is after an event, after an incident has occurred. Many organizations lose hours and days trying to work out exactly what's been compromised because they don't have an up-to-date data map. They don't have an up-to-date data inventory. It's a critical component of a robust and resilient response to a cyber incident. So an inventory of personal information, data flows mapped, make sure those data flows are compliant with legal requirements in each of the jurisdictions through which they're going. And there are a number of practical steps that you can take to implement what we talk about as a cyber defense in depth strategy, a recognition that defense in depth needs to be built so that you can genuinely become resilient. And defense in depth starts off with a front line, which is essentially about detecting attacks. So that's vulnerability scanning, continual vulnerability scanning, remediating vulnerabilities. Remember that the vulnerabilities that you know about, cyber criminals also know about. They're on a public database. The least you can do is make sure you don't have any of them. So continually scanning with regularly updated scanners is a logical thing to be doing. Multi-factor authentication, phishing staff awareness, updating staff awareness training for staff. Doing a once-a-year staff awareness training program simply doesn't cut the mustard because phishing attacks change, and the success of phishing attacks, the ease of crafting them, phishing as a service, all of the different ways in which cybercrime gangs and nation states are able to weaponize attacks means that you need to do first-line anti-phishing and staff awareness training on a regular, quarterly, or even more frequent update basis. Your second line of defense would be a much more robust set of responses. So cyber incident response, data breach reporting, penetration testing, a step up from vulnerability scanning, a trained ethical hacker looking to see how vulnerabilities and configuration issues in websites in the cloud, in your cloud infrastructure could be exploited. Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus, if you're in the UK, properly trained cyber security, IT support, GDPR staff awareness, all of the stuff which enables staff to better recognize attacks when they're taking place, be better placed to respond to and deal with them. The third line of defense is effectively maturing it, is putting risk-based security controls such as ISO 27001 certification, SOC 2 compliance audits into place so that you know that the way in which you're defending from attacks is in line with the organization's risk appetite. Management has a much more mature dashboard of the extent to which identified vulnerabilities are under control and threats are mitigated. And then fourth line of defense is happening beyond the organization. So secure the organization first, and then look at what's happening in the supply chain. Make sure that you can rebuild. So good IT disaster recovery, business continuity management, integrate them into your information security management processes so you can seamlessly go from responding to an incident to invoking a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan in a way that enables the organization to get its processes back to a minimum operating level within the target time period. Think of your fifth line of defense as being cybersecurity insurance. It shouldn't be anything more advanced than that. Cybersecurity insurance, remember, simply helps you mitigate impact. It doesn't help you mitigate likelihood. You're not going to draw on cybersecurity insurance until you have been breached. And the damage which a cyber attack does is significantly greater, most organizations discover, than their cybersecurity insurance will pay them for. Yes, the insurance might, until it's banned, give you the money that helps you pay for a ransom. Yes, it might help you deal with the initial costs, but no, mostly it won't help you deal with all of the significant rebuilding that you have to do afterwards, and very rarely will it even begin to cover the damage that it does to your reputation. It certainly won't help you rebuild the damage done to directors' reputation, and it won't help you rebuild damage done to share price for listed organizations. So think of cyber insurance as a fifth line of defense, and note that cyber insurance has increased significantly in cost. We see and hear from clients that cyber insurance premiums have gone up anywhere between 25 and 125%, and the number of organizations prepared to offer cyber insurance has reduced remarkably. So you kind of need to put in place cyber defense controls, which mean that relying on cyber insurance is simply not something you need to do. So build cyber security, cyber defense in depth. That's fundamental. There's a number of ways as an organization we can help you. You can read more about services like vulnerability scanning and phishing awareness training programs, ongoing monthly and quarterly training programs on our website. So when you get the slides, you can click through to those two pages. You can take a look at incident response and the key elements of incident response, how to put that together, at what's required around the data breach reporting stage, what elements there have to be in our in-house law company, GRCI Law. We help clients report a number of breaches to the ICO and to other supervisory authorities week in, week out, which means we're very good at knowing what has to be reported. And of course, supervisory authorities know that we know, so that kind of simplifies the reporting process. We've recently launched Cyber Safeguard. It's really cybersecurity as a service, which you could think of as being a packaged cyber defense in-depth offering. It's got vulnerability scanning, it's got anti-phishing training, it's got other training elements in it, and it brings with it up to £500,000 worth of embedded cybersecurity insurance, which you don't have to do anything more for than simply deploy the elements which are in the package. So it's a very solid route that organizations can go if they're looking for a very quick route into the beginnings of an integrated multi-level cyber defense in-depth offering. And again, you can read more about that on our website. Data flow mapping, I've spoken about a number of times. There's a data flow mapping tool. I think the Vigilance software data flow mapping tool is unique in a number of ways, but you can read more about it, read more about the actions and steps necessary to give you a genuine and updatable and maintainable database of data flows. Because it's not that you need a single today data flow map, you need to be able to update it with changes in process. You need to be able to familiarize new people who join the organization with how data flows. You need something which is up to date and robust, and a data flow mapping tool should give you that. So all of those and more you can get on our websites in the UK, in Europe, and in the US. You can get us by telephone, by email, in social media. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can get hold of us, which, ladies and gentlemen, brings me of what I'd planned to say. It was only going to be 45 minutes. So if there are any questions, there's a bit of time now left over for anybody who has questions arising from any part of what I said. If you've got a question, please type it into the Q&A section, and I'll share the question and the answer with folk. The Q&A section you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. So a question: what cybersecurity landscape recommendations with AI, current trend in cybersecurity being introduced in all market segments? I'm not sure I fully understand. This is a bit of a, you've left a few too many words out of this for me. Are you asking what AI-driven cybersecurity you should be looking at, or what AI attacks you should be looking out for? Let me perhaps basically answer both. Okay, so attacks we should be looking out for, so AI-driven attacks, we see a lot more of those at the moment around fake news and what's happening in botnets. We see limited amounts of AI-driven attacks on organizations. We would expect to see those escalate fairly dramatically over the course of the next year or two. Mostly what we see inside networks when attackers get inside are attacks which are designed to execute, so they're code, they execute, they're designed to proliferate through networks, but they're not yet genuinely AI-driven. They're simply code executing, but I would expect to see within the next 6 to 18 months a proliferation in AI-driven attacks that organizations need to worry about. There is beginning to be some organizations who have AI-driven internet defenses, which are designed to try and spot and block AI attacks, but it's a whole new area of development that is for us to look forward to, but not yet a major issue. I might be getting hung up on language, but what is your interpretation of what boosting our cyber offense means? What would that look like in practice? You're not necessarily getting hung up on language. The logic of cyber offense means attacking back. And the most logical ways of attacking back would be identifying IP addresses from which attacks come. The attacks might be DoD attacks. There might be download of malware, and is attacking those with floods of with data, attacking them with counter malware attacks. Those are the kind of logical things that organizations could do today. There's no reason why, because an organization has attacked you with a whole bunch of malware, you can't identify the IP address and attack back. Of course, if the attack is coming through a set of lockout routers, then you won't find out where the attack originates, but you can perhaps take down the interlinking routers. But if it's coming across multiple spaces, that gets to be harder. So how cyber offense develops is going to be, again, one of those particularly interesting areas. I think that the government, in allocating just £22 million to it in the UK, is kind of admitting that it doesn't really know what it's going to do yet, but that it's an important area that it needs to be looking at how it can do something. And again, I would expect to see activity in that area. The reality that the attacks on satellite GPS systems are already driving UK and US armed forces to look at other methods of providing locational data and communication information to ground troops is an indication of how quickly systems can evolve when dealing with the reality of warfare. But I'm not yet seeing, other than the kind of premeditated attacks that you saw on that you see Israel, for instance, carrying out on Iranian nuclear development facilities, which are premeditated in the sense that malware is got beyond an air firewall. by means of tricking somebody into picking up and plugging in a USB stick which downloads malware. Those kind of offensive attacks are simply cyber attacks or nation state cyber attacks. They're not offensive as in counter-offensive, which is, I think, the direction that the UK wants to be going. I hope those answers have been helpful. They, from my perspective, are mostly saying there's lots to happen. It hasn't happened yet. Are there any other questions, folks, that you would like to ask at this point? If not, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Do, if we can help you deal with this evolving set of challenges, building cyber defense in depth into your organization, please do give us a shout, talk to your account manager, come onto our website, get hold of us on social media, call us, email me, and we'll talk to you about how we can help you make sure you stay safe in today's environment. And good luck. Bye-bye.